Hi, this is Brandy Shantz, and you're listening to Living Chronic. Today, I'm speaking with John. He is a podcast host. He is the only psychedelic posture therapist in the world. He runs Chronic Pain Rewired and is ready to bring us a lot of great insight into how to relieve pain. So, welcome, John. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Brandy. I'm happy to be here.
I really love how you responded to dealing with pain. So I'd like to start to just talking a little bit about you and your background and how all this started.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I did everything wrong for about a decade and a half. That's how I responded to pain initially. But eventually, I did figure out how to deal with it. Maybe a little thick-headed, but now I'm pretty good with it. I was 17 years old when I broke my L5 vertebra in half in a skiing accident in Colorado. And it was 16 years of ever worsening pain for the most part before I found what worked for me. And for me, that was posture therapy. By that point, when my dad bought me a book on posture therapy, I'd been in a wheelchair for about 3 years. I was suffering from really severe chronic pain. I had carpal tunnel as well, so I had problems in my upper body, my lower body. I was a mess. I was more than 400. I weighed more than 425 pounds at that time. I I was just basically spending my days not swallowing a bullet. That's kind of where I was at that point in time. My dad bought me a book called Pain Free by a guy named Pete Egoscue. I saw the title Pain Free, and I don't know what you do with cursing on this, but I told my dad, this is a bunch of BS, you know.
Oh, I've been there before. Been there
Like
before.
I even found like the title offensive. I was like, this like there's no such thing as living without pain.
Right.
That's at least not for me. You know, at that point, that's what I believed. And my dad basically told me, look, if you want to live under my roof, you're gonna read this book. And thank God he did apply some of that tough love there, because that was when my life started to turn around right there.
Hmm.
I read the first few chapters, and it was a completely different perspective on pain. And it was stuff that I understood, that I knew. Like I told doctors, like, I feel like my body isn't moving right, and I feel like I was familiar with this concept of compensation, compensating movement patterns and stuff, but I hadn't been able to find anyone who knew how to do anything about it, you know. And I tried one of the exercises. Well, after I read the first few chapters, that's how the author suggests you do it. Is, kind of get an understanding of what you're doing, and then give it a shot.
Hmm.
And it was a very simple position. I just was laying on the ground with my hips bent at 90 degrees and then my knees bent at 90 degrees, just laying there for an extended period of time. After about 10 minutes, I wasn't out of pain or anything, but I felt something different,
Hmm.
right? I felt that this is like, I've lost count of how many physical therapists I've been to by that point. Well, why hasn't anyone just told me to lay in this position? And so I decided to give it a shot. There was a handful of exercises out of that book. There was maybe 50 or so exercises in the book. I could do a handful of them, literally about 5 of them. And I just did those every day for the next 2 months. And suddenly one day I stood up out of my wheelchair just for a few seconds. But I knew there was something really different about this type of therapy at that point.
And that's what's so remarkable about your story, because I, like you, and I know there's so many people out there, they hear this, well, you can get out of pain, or there's a relationship between your brain and pain.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whatever. But
Yeah, in our culture, it's not very well understood.
and it sounds offensive. Again, it's just one of those things I think so many of us have been through. I was in the
Mm-hmm.
doctor pissed up, ready for a fight when he said something about it being in my head. And I thought, are you crazy,
Mm-hmm.
doc? But what's remarkable is there's a lot to it, and you went from being in a wheelchair for quite some time
Yeah,
to
I was in the wheelchair for about 3 years before I found posture therapy. Took about 9 months to get to a point where I no longer needed the wheelchair. So all in all, it was between 3.5 and 4 years that I was using the wheelchair.
Mhm.
And at that point, I still wasn't even aware of like the mind-body connection stuff that much. It would be another 18 months or so from that point before I really started to learn even like the basics about that.
Right.
And, um, how that worked for me was I kept on doing the posture therapy. Like as soon as I stood up out of the wheelchair that first time, my family and I were like, okay, we got to find. I didn't know like where to go from there. Right? It was like there were all these other exercises I couldn't do. I was doing all the ones that I could do that I was aware of, and I was like, well, what do I do? So we hired a posture therapist, someone from the Agoski Clinic at that point, and then it was like a month or two later, I started studying to become a posture therapist as well because my therapist was like, "Look, you should learn this stuff. Like this is something that you're like you don't want to be in therapy forever. Like you want to." And like getting a certificate was as much as like a second round of therapy would have been. So I was like, okay, I'll try doing both at the same time. I wasn't employed at the time. I was at the kind of end of my ropes. I could barely think. At most times, it felt like the pain was just so severe. So I got a year of treatment. I got 16 sessions, which lasted about a year, and then I just kind of took over on my own from there with what I was learning, and kept on progressing for like 6 months. But then my progress halted, like just grinded to a halt, and for 6 months I could not move forward. I
Mhm.
still in lots of pain. I was walking around and stuff. On my good days, I might even be able to go do something like, go to a golf course and, um, ride the cart right up to the ball, get out of the cart, whack the ball, get back in the. On a bad day, though, something like going to the grocery store or walking, any type of extended walking could cause me lots of severe pain for quite some time. And I didn't understand why what was working suddenly had stopped working. Right? Like why couldn't like I knew all the exercises, but I couldn't put them together. Like with this type of therapy, the sequence in which you do these exercises, there's hundreds of these exercises to pick from, and the
Mhm.
sequence, the ones you choose makes a difference, but the order you do them in makes a difference as well.
Right.
And I was just at this point where I couldn't figure out how to get any better. And now I know that's because I was reaching this point where my brain was getting in the way, um, yeah, I didn't
A lot
sta
of people start to get lost,
yeah.
us both included.
Mhm.
What do you mean your mind's in the way? How is this possible?
Yeah, it's our brains. And when I was in pain, I hated hearing this. So if you're in pain right now and you're listening to me and you're hating me talking about this, that's okay. I
Mhm.
completely understand. But our brains are capable of creating real symptoms of pain, absent of um, injury in the body, absent of what we define as injury in the body, right?
Right, and that's, I think,
In
where a
Western
lot of
culture.
people get stuck. When a
Hmm.
doctor says to you, and, to be fair, medical school does not have any communications classes involved, although I won't ignore it. That's where everybody gets stuck, right? "Doc,
Hmm.
how I feel real pain. What do you mean it's in my head?" Because we assume that
Right.
means that we're faking it, that we're crazy, that
Hmm.
we're, delusional, but none of these things are true, right?
No, no, that's not. Just because the pain is being created by the brain does not mean that the pain is not real.
Mhm,
It is exactly as real as if you go and stub your toe right now.
mhm.
The pain is exactly as real. And that's where I think, like I said, in our culture, we have this like big disconnect of well, how are we supposed to get past that, right?
Mhm.
Like, um, there are a number of ways. Different things work for different people. Uh, the way that worked for me, again, I didn't even know this was happening at that point in time. Um, I did still have like some severe postural issues. Like I still did have like a pretty severe anterior pelvic tilt that was putting a lot of stress on my low back, on the soft tissues throughout my low back. And I still had some nerves that were being impinged. Like there were some things going on in the body. I just couldn't, the brain was getting in the way of fixing these things.
Right.
These movement patterns were so deeply ingrained, not just in the musculoskeletal system, they're ingrained in the nervous system and in the brain itself, in the neural connections that, you know, in posture therapy, we always say, well, what what moves muscle or what moves bones? Well, muscles move bones, right? If a bone is out of place, it's because the muscles have put it out of place because muscles move bones. But what moves muscles? And that's our brain.
Yep.
And so if our brain is the brain is not able to send the signals, if there's a disconnect between the mind and the body that where the brain is not able to overcome, regardless of the physical stimulus being applied, these muscular patterns, these movement patterns, these dysfunctional compensational movement patterns that are happening, the brain can create these movement patterns just as well as the body can create them.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I came to just begin understanding this was completely by accident for me. I my CPAP broke one day. CPAP I'd been using for, by that point, 8 years or so, finally broke down. And the insurance company was dragging their feet, not wanting to buy a new one. And I couldn't sleep.
Mm-hmm.
My life was starting to like go downhill really fast. You know, a couple days without sleep, and things get pretty rough.
Yeah.
So a week or two into that, my girlfriend said, "Hey, look on Facebook, just see if there's something." I was not thinking clearly at this point. I was like, "Oh yeah, I should do that," you know. So I went on Facebook Marketplace, found someone who knew about this or who had one, and he actually he had previously worked at a respiratory clinic or something along those lines. He knew how to go into the system. He plugged it in. He's like, "Okay, what PSI are you at?" And he did all the settings for me, and we just got to talking. He was a really interesting guy, and I was, started talking about uh, type of stuff I've been telling you with posture therapy and all this stuff, and my problems with pain. And he said, well, just hold on a minute. And you went into his house and came back out with a little bag of mushrooms, and he gave them to me. He said, "Here, try these."
Which is not what we would normally think. Hey, this is the turning point, right?
No, this,
Turning point
yeah,
is wild.
yeah. Especially in our culture, being exposed to a new drug from some guy you just met is probably
Yes.
not something you would think is going to change your life for the better.
This used to be a commercial we'd see on Saturday mornings in the 80s.
Yeah, just say no.
Yeah.
um, I didn't try them at first. I set them aside for several weeks. But that CPAP worked great for me until I got a nice new replacement from the insurance company, and I was getting to a point where I was thinking more clearly and stuff, and kind of returning to normal, what was normal for me at the time, and that's when I decided, okay, I'm gonna give these a shot. I knew absolutely nothing about magic mushrooms. I was very naive to this whole world at that point, and I took like a small dose, like about a gram or so. I think it was 1 or 1.25 grams. It wasn't like a very intense experience, but I could kind of feel my brain getting out of the way to a certain extent, and I could feel the intense muscle spasms relax a bit. I could feel the nerve pain decrease a bit. And it was just temporary. This wasn't like a life-changing experience or anything. But I got this idea in my head of, well, what if this was some of the like most effective muscle spasm relief I'd ever experienced.
Right.
So I thought, well, I know all these hundreds of posture exercises, and I had read up that if I take a bigger dose, it would last about 6 hours or so. So, well, what if I start doing all these posture exercises when my body is more relaxed like this? Maybe I can shake something loose. Maybe I can make something happen, right?
And you know what's so brilliant about this for everybody thinking, oh, taking psychedelic drugs to exercise, this sounds crazy. But our muscle relaxers, when my doctor finally prescribed me a muscle relaxer, because of course my muscles were in just knots
Mm-hmm.
from all of the drug
Mm-hmm.
induced movements, I couldn't move. And I thought, yes, something that's just going to make my muscles loosen up. And on the days where I was experiencing high pain, I asked my doctor if I should just take additional muscle relaxer pills, thinking that it would just be extra oomph to
Mm-hmm.
smooth out the muscle. He said, no, it's actually the muscle relaxers don't actually relax your muscle. It works on your brain.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, yeah. They work on
So,
receptors in the brain.
which was a real moment for me. I thought, no wonder it's not working.
And
But
yeah. No, go ahead.
it is in the brain, right? It's not so
Yeah.
crazy
Mm-hmm.
to take this leap and think that these low doses of a magic mushroom can help you in many respects to get
Mm-hmm.
through that mind stoppage. To make
Yeah. And I know a lot more about that now, and I can talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, I was in this place where, like, Flexeril, which is one of the most commonly prescribed muscle relaxants,
the one I
that
take.
that didn't work for me. Like, it would relax the muscles a bit, but I would have these just horrifying nightmares with it. I could not take Flexeril. Um, Soma worked okay, but it's addictive.
Mhm.
Um, and by that point, it wasn't very readily prescribed because of the other negative effects that come along
Right.
with it. Um, so I wasn't able to. The other ones that had been prescribed to me didn't do much of anything. So I was at this point where pharmaceutically, like, this was the first thing that had ever actually worked without negative side effects for me.
Mhm.
Um, so I called up that guy. I still had his number, and I said, "Look, is there any way I can, like, try a larger dose?" That was an experience that changed my, exactly as much as learning about posture therapy had changed my life. This changed my life, perhaps even more so.
Mhm.
It had many more effects outside of just of pain relief for me, and it wasn't so much that it solved my pain problems. It gave me the tools to solve the problems myself.
Mhm.
Um, I had a very, for me, a very profound experience. And when this medicine eventually kind of reached its peak, which is usually after like 2.5 to 3 hours, I is just this vision of a musculoskeletal system kind of appeared in front of me, and it was doing every exercise that I did, and I was seeing these exercises from a different perspective. I was starting to, I could see the soft tissue and the bones in each of these positions, and I was getting a deeper insight as to what was happening in my body when I was going through these positions. And eventually I asked it. It was very interactive. I could, like, see it from any direction. I could, like, add and remove layers of tissue. It was an incredible experience. Something I'll probably never experience again in my life. But I asked it, well, what do I need to do to get better? Like, you're just mimicking me. Like, show me something. And then it started doing exercises, and I got to mimic it.
Okay.
And it was, some of these strains of mushrooms, they call them like golden teachers or something like that. This experience was teaching me.
Yes.
This isn't just like getting high and disconnecting from reality. This is connecting with reality in a whole new way. It completely reframing the way that you interact with your body, with the world, things like this. And people, if you've never taken psychedelic substances, but you've heard someone talk about like receiving downloads or things like this, it sounds completely crazy. I know it sounds completely crazy, but it was like eventually this vision started going faster than I could keep up with, and things just kind of became a blur. But from that point forward, after I received this like quote unquote download, I was never stuck about what these exercises were doing for me. I was never stuck with which ones I might try. If I try one that doesn't work, like I could reason out and make hypotheses about, okay, I should try these ones and I should sequence them this way and see what works and see what didn't work. And I was never stuck from that point forward. And I started making incredibly rapid progress. 6 months later, I competed in a disc golf tournament, and that tournament was a 9-mile hike through the mountains here in New Mexico. It was, and it allowed my brain to get out of the way. It allowed me to, one, I didn't have this mental block of I just don't understand it and I'm stuck and this is how it's always going to be. I didn't keep on using the mushrooms. I tried them one more time after that, and my girlfriend had a really challenging experience. And after helping her through that, I was like, okay, I need to put these things aside. Like, there's something way more powerful here happening than I understand, and I need to take what I got and move with it. Just run with it from there. So it wasn't that I kept on using mushrooms and I kept on improving. It was this one experience gave me years of things to chew on.
Yes.
And
just making that turn, that's what's so difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start to understand it a little bit more. You allow this new information to come in. You stop trying to fight everybody every time they say mind. But it's that turning point where your mind allows you to start healing and to start finding the ways to get yourself where you need to be. That's what it's really about, finding that turning point for yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was very noticeable after that my mind-body connection had been restored.
Mm-hmm.
That I was receiving, my brain was receiving information from my body in a different way, and it was sending information to my body in a different way. Like, it was like there was a 10-car pile up in my nervous system before that, and things just weren't flowing.
Right.
But after that, I could feel things. I could feel my body in a different way. I could experience my own body in a completely different way. I just before that disc golf tournament, which I came in last, by the way. I did not perform well, but I did it.
Walking on the couch, lapping the old and the wheel.
But I'd been holding off. Like, I'd finished like the training a long time before that, the posture therapy training, but I'd held off on actually like taking the test and getting certified, because like if I can't, my idea at that point was like, if I can't heal myself, like what business do I have going out and telling anyone else that I can do anything to help them, But shortly before that tournament, I took the test. I got my certification. I started a business. I started making YouTube videos, like trying to get my name out there and stuff. Worked with a number of clients over the course of the next year, and saw some amazing things happen with other people as well. About a year after that tournament, I got a job as the lead posture therapist for one of the biggest names in posture therapy on social media, Posture Guy Mike. Started an online clinic where I eventually was like working with 100 people at one point. But throughout all this, I just couldn't put to rest what had happened to me with the mushrooms. And while I saw most people get great results, there were some people who just weren't making that kind of progress, right?
Mhm.
And I started to notice that by and large, a lot of these people who weren't making the progress had comorbidities with other
Mhm.
types of mental health problems,
Right.
depression, fibromyalgia, which I personally consider to be a mental health problem primarily. Um, and I have helped people with fibromyalgia,
Yeah.
but and I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, a long time ago. I was diagnosed with the fibromyalgia, the chronic fatigue syndrome, complex regional pain syndrome. I'd received all those things too, and I mean, now it's pretty well accepted that there is something different going on in the brains of people with these types of disorders. It's not
Mhm.
a strictly, well, the brain is a physical thing, and so there's something physically, uh, I don't say wrong, but physically mismanaged, is maybe a better word. Um, it's not something that strictly originates in the body. And so with people with fibromyalgia, I would help them improve their posture, and they would improve to a certain extent, but then the progress might halt.
Mhm.
Similar with chronic fatigue syndrome, similar with complex regional pain syndrome, these types of things. Um, autoimmune disorders as well followed a similar pattern, I noticed. And I was never able to shake this experience with the mushrooms. I'd been in my free time, I was always learning more and more about it, reading papers, watching documentaries, reading books. And another big shift in my understanding came when I read a book not about pain at all, but uh, called Reality Switch Technologies by a man named Andrew Gallimore. And he was talking about the book itself was about, the primary objective or topic of the book was how psychedelics affect the workings of our brain. But in order to talk about that, you first had to talk, well, what's going on in the brain? How, like if psychedelics are changing how we're perceiving reality, but how do we perceive reality in the first place,
Mhm.
right? And that book really was like a whole nother leap forward in my understanding of what had happened to me, because I was just on this mission of trying to figure like what the heck had happened to me, like how can this one experience change everything, right? When I way I mean, I highly suggest I can it's a decent sized book, and it's dealing with lots of neuroscience and chemistry and biology and things like this. So obviously I can't
Well,
describe the whole book,
I'll
but
be sure to
it's
add
it's
it to the
yeah,
episode notes because I've been loving a lot of these books. So I mean, it's just so insightful
yeah,
for learning how how do I get
yeah.
better? How do I get my life?
And what it came down to was we never experience reality itself. Like we all think we're living in reality,
Mhm.
but no human being has ever actually experienced it. Right? We're experiencing a decent model that our brains create. Our brains are literally generating our experience of reality all the time.
Yes.
Like even most of the sensory data that our eyes and our ears and our sensory, various sensory organs, even most of that is completely discarded by the brain. Most raw sensory data is just tossed out,
Mhm.
and the models that the brain has for how these organs should be interacting, things like this, uh, for this information we're receiving, all this sensory data gets compared to the model, and anything that fits the model just gets tossed out.
Mhm.
So, like, I can watch my glass of tea here go across the screen. As long as it doesn't change course, there's very little actual sensory information that's becoming reaching my conscious awareness. The
Mhm.
brain knows what the glass is, knows how it looks like, knows what the shapes, has models for all the shapes that make up the ice cubes and all these things. And as it keeps on moving, it's creating those images mostly out of what it remembers.
Mhm.
Then when something changes, a prediction error, the sensory data isn't matching the model. Okay, we had a model of this cut moving because our brain is also trying to predict everything that's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's really being compared to what the brain thinks is about to happen.
Yes.
So once that stops, then okay, the model gets updated. Some sensory prediction errors bubble to the top. Some sensory information gets through. And he didn't talk about this in the book, but we have a model for how our body works. It's called body schema. And this body schema is basically your brain's model of how your body, like how bent are your limbs, in order to be able to do something like reach for a glass and pick it up without looking at it, we have to have a model not just of where the glass is in external reality, but where our limbs are oriented in space, how bent they are, and and a model of how the body needs to move to go reach for that glass, right? So this body schema incorporates things like how our brains, how our muscles move. If we have a compensating relationship pattern, like one of the easiest ones I can use to demonstrate for this for people is if you imagine someone whose arm can't go into full shoulder flexion like this.
Mm-hmm.
But every day they need to reach for a glass that's in the cupboard and it's just outside their abilities of their shoulder to go into flexion. What they're going to do is raise up the shoulder girdle, bend at the spine, and get a couple inches of extra reach here, right? And if we keep on using these compensating muscle patterns or movement patterns to achieve that task, eventually you can't raise this arm without this type of thing happening.
Yes.
And those movement patterns get ingrained into the muscles, into the joints, the soft tissues. It also gets ingrained into the brain. And that's all part of body schema. That's how our body moves, our brain's model of how our body moves.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I began to understand was, well, when I took this psilocybin and started doing these exercises, these corrective exercises designed to change how my body moves, my body schema model had been blown out of the water completely. It had been dismantled, and I was consciously rebuilding how that body schema was formulated in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I really started to understand this stuff a lot better, I was also learning how to facilitate psilocybin sessions. I'm in a psilocybin church, a mushroom church, and I've received a lot of training through there for facilitating these sessions safely. And now I'm at the point where I'm taking this and guiding other people through these types of experiences. The first time I did it, I knew I was really onto something.
Mm-hmm.
I was working with a person who actually had this type of problem where they couldn't, this type of thing going on with their right arm. I'd been working with this person for about 2 years with posture therapy, and we had made great strides. But for the past 6 months or so, there had just been no progress. Yeah, it was just at this. We had reached a glass ceiling. We couldn't break through it, and there was a problem in his hip. A problem. He had 2 fake knees. He had rotator cuff surgeries in both arms. The doctor had clipped his bicep in his right arm when doing one of the surgeries. He was a mess when we started.
Right.
And this past winter, he was skiing and things like this. So he'd made like lots and lots of progress, right? Skiing and hiking and back to doing lots of great stuff. But he still couldn't lift his arm over his head. And when we started, he had some pretty severe carpal tunnel. It was down to just his fingertips at that point, but it had been there for like 6 months in both his hands. So I designed like a 3 or 4 hour exercise program for him. to try during a moderate dose of psilocybin.
Mhm.
I found that the kind of sweet spot is where you get people with closed eye visuals, but you want their vision to be pretty much undisturbed with their eyes open.
Right.
And the visuals play a crucial role. Just like me, I had this visual experience of how to change how my body worked. The visuals can play a critical role. I took him through maybe a dozen exercises or so, and nothing too interesting was happening. But I put him into this position where he's laying on the ground with his legs going straight up the wall, bottom of the feet pointed towards the ceiling. And I'd had him in this position many times before, but I noticed something different.
Mm-hmm.
This time, one of his feet was pointing pretty close to the ceiling. The other foot was cockeyed like this.
Right.
And so I said, well, stop there. Let me go get a block and a strap. So I put a block between his ankles. I put a strap around his ankles, and that forced
Mm-hmm.
the other foot to approach a more normal position because it was putting pressure on the outside and something on the inside to kind of put it back into place. And his visuals went completely black, right? On this side, just on this side.
Mm-hmm.
And he reported this to me. I said, okay, we'll just start trying to figure out how to make them come back.
Right.
And eventually over here, he's seeing the visuals he's reporting to me are like, okay, I'm seeing like things being rewired, like circuitry and things like this. And he's like, okay, I can feel like now I feel because he changed that to my ankle, I'm feeling this weird stuff in this problem with my hip, and I'm feeling it in my shoulder, and I'm feeling it in my neck. Like all these problem areas were all linked to one thing down in his ankles. And eventually, over here where it had been black, it was going between, it was kind of flashing between black and white. And eventually, he says, "Okay, take the strap and the block off. You know, they're telling me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who they are, but this is what he's like. They're telling me to do this." And I take it off, and he just starts. He kind of rolls. He's on his back, but he kind of rolls over to the side with his legs still against the wall. And he just starts moving in all these kind of weird ways. I'm like, I ask him, what are you doing? I'm doing what they're telling me to do. Immediately after that session, he just kind of kept on doing that for a while until things started to wear off. He was just kind of fixing himself. You know, there's this kind of innate wisdom of the brain, like reconnecting with the body. And initially after that, he took a bottle of mustard, actually, that was in the fridge, and he took it right up over his head with no problems. And the next day, only, I think, 2 of his fingers had any numbness in them. The pins and needles, the tingling, that had ceased across all the fingers. But there was still a bit of numbness. And we just saw progress on all these fronts even continue and become more pronounced over the next several weeks. It was, so that was when it's kind of I call it the postradelic hypothesis, right? This idea that we can use these medicines to alter our body schema. And this isn't that new of an idea.
Mm-hmm.
The first research into using psychedelics for phantom limb pain was published in 1930.
This has been around for a while. I mean, I know I've been reading a lot about it in terms of helping veterans get through PTSD, but I mean, this has been around for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing new.
Yeah.
And you said that for some people, in your experience, there is some difficulties using this kind of treatment if there's comorbidities. What have you been doing to get through that? Or is this something that can be dealt with by addressing things from many angles? Because that does seem to be what I'm learning a lot about. It's not one thing. You know, I can't control my current diet. I can't solve my pain just by taking a muscle relaxer. But if I do all of the things, if I work on my body, if I work through therapy, if I eat the right diet, if I do all of these things, then I start to see progress. But it can't just be one.
Yeah. So before I was trained in facilitating these types of sessions, some of the ways I was approaching people when they were kind of at the stuck point is I was recommending specifically like the hip flexor function seems to be tied in with the emotional aspects or the mental aspects to a large degree. Our primary hip flexors, the iliopsoas muscles, we don't really have very much conscious control over these skeletal muscles.
Right.
You can tell someone to put their hips into flexion, but if you tell someone to activate their psoas muscle, very few people can actually do it.
Yeah.
It's a, even though it's called a primary hip flexor, it's not like the primary flexor as in, I can tell someone to flex their biceps and they, okay, I can flex my biceps. Like we don't, it's that the psoas muscles, which for people who don't know, they connect to the, I'll just stand up, it's a little easier. I think you can see me.
Yeah.
They connect at the top of the femur. They're the groin muscle. They connect at the top of the femur. They go through the spine or through the pelvis and attach to the front of all the lumbar vertebrae. And these muscles play a critical role in lots of postural conditions because we primarily categorize posture off pelvic tilt. Mm-hmm. And when the hip flexor muscles are not working properly, either working too hard or shut down, there's or some degree in between, that presents as pelvic tilt in one way or another. Mm-hmm. Or pelvic rotation. If one hip flexor is overactive and the other is underactive, the pelvis can become rotated. Yep. And that can cause all types of painful problems like sciatica. If I can derotate someone's pelvis, if they've got sciatica on just one side of their body, that will most of the time help quite a bit. Yeah. But I was having people do things like getting into a position that's designed to correct hip flexor function, so like certain groin stretches or things like this, and asking them to listen to like shamanic drumming tracks is one of the things I was having people do, because shamanic, these or binaural beat type music, things that are designed to get your brain to come into the two hemispheres of the brain to align their brainwave patterns on each side of the body. Sometimes this is another thing that is not very well understood in Western culture, but hypnosis is not like what you see in the movies. It's a very different thing in real life. But there was a great podcast on this just recently on Max Lugavere's podcast, The Genius Life. He had one of I'm blanking on the doctor's name, but a doctor who specializes in this hypnosis type stuff, has worked with like over 7,000 clients. That can be effective for reestablishing the mind-body connection. Mm-hmm. Things like breathing exercises. I would often recommend people try various breathing exercises. In my experience, one of the most surefire ways is psilocybin.
Well, psychedelic therapist, not just the postural therapist.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All these other types of things I've just mentioned, there can be cultural barriers,
yes,
to how well they're going to work for an individual, especially in a highly material culture like ours, where we're resistant to the idea that the brain can be involved in these processes to the degree it is. But in reality, the body is an extension of the brain, in my view, and it's.
And I think we could probably do an entire episode, just on that brain connection, mm-hmm. talking about how
definitely.
We already recognize, because we recognize that in life anyways, right? That's why people can see events in two completely different ways.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You have a crime committed and there's a bunch of witnesses. They all go to court. The chances, like, if you hear two versions of events that line up completely, it's like, okay, well, they were coached to say that pretty much.
No, exactly. You have experience, and it's very difficult, but it's we look at somebody else and think, how could you have possibly seen that? But a lot of
Hmm.
it's comes from how your life has been shaped. How were you raised? What were
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
taught from birth? Belief system. That's why we start from birth, right?
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
that it wires your brain to think a certain way. There's
Hmm.
a reason they want
Yep.
you to start when they're first born and not 18 and then give them a stack of 14 belief systems and choose, right?
Hmm.
Because you want to wire a person's brain in a certain way. So it's
Yeah.
important to recognize that on some level.
Hmm. And when people aren't responding to these kind of more moderate approaches, I think it's often because they fundamentally don't believe that it can work.
Hmm.
Um, Psilocybin can offer the ability to break down our models of what we believe is possible and impossible.
Yes.
It breaks down our ego. So, our ego is a model of what we tell ourselves about ourselves. So, it breaks down our models of internal reality. Um, what I was talking about in that case study, that was a form of synesthesia. That he was processing his synesthesia is when you see sounds, for instance, which is a
Hmm.
very common thing with psychedelics. The visuals, you might have your eyes closed and be seeing all these crazy things, all these shapes and colors and patterns. And then you hear a sound and everything gets altered by what you're seeing because you're processing sound through your visual cortex.
Hmm.
In his case, he was processing information from his somatosensory cortex through his visual cortex. And it was allowing him a new way to approach the problem he was experiencing. His brain was able to think about it and process information in a way that had been completely inaccessible to him beforehand.
Hmm.
So we experience visual disturbances, we experience auditory disturbances, and all these different models of how we perceive the world. And if I had just given him psilocybin or if he had just decided to take some and lay on his bed, the chances of him experiencing relief on these things that we were specifically targeting were probably very close to zero.
Hmm.
It requires movement. And this is backed up by research. When we look at the studies that have been done for phantom limb pain in psychedelics,
Hmm.
it's a similar thing. The someone may have lost their arm in an accident. Their brain still has a model of how that arm is supposed to work. Likely because of the trauma that goes along with the accident,
Hmm.
that uh, the model of how their body schema model hasn't been updated.
Right.
When we look at the research in psychedelics for phantom limb pain, they say movement seems to be key to making progress.
Yep.
If you give someone who's experiencing phantom limb pain um, a dose of LSD and they just lay there, they're probably not going to experience very much relief. But if they're moving and reteaching their brain how to interact with this limb, because what was happening before is the brain thinks the limb is supposed to be there at a very deep level. There's no sensory information coming in, and because, like we talked about earlier, our brains are so good at filling in the gaps.
Yes.
In fact, that's most of what we experience is when our brain fills in the gaps.
Hmm.
It's putting something in the place of the sensation from the limb, and the way that our brain tells us when there's something wrong with our body is pain. So the
Yeah.
brain knows there's something going on with this limb. Hey, I can't feel the hand. Well, then why am I feeling pain in the hand, right? Like
Yeah.
that's got to be an incredibly frustrating thing. But then we break down the model of of how the brain is expecting to process information from this hand. And now it's starting to realize, oh, there's something fundamentally different here. Now we're rebuilding the body schema in a way that doesn't rely on this hand being there.
Yeah. It's amazing, what the mind can do. And I think that, uh, you know, all of us, whether you're living chronic, whether you're just, maybe somebody who is, maybe you just want to make a
Mm-hmm.
change in life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it really could be that simple. I mean, I've always said, when am I the most productive? It's when I'm busy. Why? Because my brain has a way of thinking and working at that point in time where I am getting things done at all times. If you take all of those things
hmm
away from me and I have nothing to do, my brain doesn't quite know how to handle it. And it
Right. Yeah.
eventually will,
Starts focusing on other
yeah,
things.
move on.
hmm
So it's really fascinating. And obviously, you've had a lot of success with yourself. I mean, that's just so amazing. Just being able to get up out of that wheelchair after 3 years is a success in and of itself. Of course, helping, everybody you've worked with has been wonderful.
hmm
So, how does everybody find you? I know your website is chronicpainrewired.com, but you have
Right.
a YouTube channel and a podcast as well.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is just called Posture Monster John. That's my moniker on Instagram, Facebook. Um, my YouTube channel, I've got about 100 videos on there of various posture exercises and how to do them. It's a great resource for people who are curious about this, all completely free. My podcast is called Chronic Pain Rewired. That's available on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, all the major podcasting platforms. It's available there. And you can reach me at chronicpainrewired@gmail.com if you have questions.
Thank you so much. I'd love to have you back again so we could explore a little bit more about those mind body connections because the more I learn, the more I want to keep learning and talking about it
Yeah.
because I know that there's so much we can do as, people living with chronic illness, chronic pain, as well as just people who want to change how they react in life. Your brain matters. It has.
Right, yeah. And these similar concepts of breaking down these models apply to a lot of these mental health conditions that are being popularized in the media right now with psychedelics. If uh, just real quick, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. They did a Netflix. His book was How to Change Your Mind, and then on Netflix they did a few episodes, like one on psilocybin, one on LSD, one on ecstasy or MDMA, and one on mescaline, I believe. But there was a great story on the one about MDMA. MDMA assisted therapy is probably going to be going into effect next year sometime,
Mhm.
and approved with approval by the FDA and whatnot. And there's a great story on there about a woman who her mother committed a murder double homicide or a double homicide suicide,
Hmm.
and she walked into the house to find the whole mess.
Right.
And the whole time after that, every time she would approach her house and she's hearing the dog scratch at the door, she would go into this like full breakdown, and
Yeah.
she didn't understand why.
Yeah. PTSD is
But
yeah.
when she had walked into that house and had found all the her mother dead and the two people her mother had killed, um, there were dogs scratching at a door in that house. She didn't even notice it at the time,
Right.
but her brain did. And her brain had this model of, okay, if you hear this, there's something bad that's about to happen, especially if it's involved with walking into a house.
Yeah.
Then she has this experience with MDMA, and she remembers this. This comes, this kind of suppressed memory comes to the surface. And then she understood why that was happening.
Mhm.
And now she was able, if she heard that when she was coming home, she was able to actually greet her dogs with joy and things like this. So
Yeah.
it's a very similar mechanism of action, it seems, for many types of problems.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights. I know I've learned a lot today. And, again, everybody, Posture Monster John, everything will be in the episode notes. So if you want to check him out, be sure to go and check out his YouTube, podcast, and Instagram. Thank you for being here and listening to Living Chronic.